Most of the goals you're chasing don't actually feel real. That's why games that give you nothing to do feel more meaningful than real life. The same reason we're obsessed with post-apocalyptic worlds isn't destruction, it's relief. In this video, we'll break down why worlds without goals restore real agency, and why control feels more real there than anywhere else. Like, subscribe, and let's begin. What agency actually is? Agency is often described as freedom. The freedom to choose, to decide, to act without constraint. But that definition misses the point. You can have endless choices and still feel powerless. You can make decisions every day and feel like none of them actually matter. Because agency is not about choosing between options. It's about whether your actions close a loop. At its core, agency is a simple structure. You form an intention. You act on it. The world responds. And you can clearly see how your action caused that response. When this loop is intact, action feels real. When it's broken, control dissolves, even if nothing is technically stopping you. This is why agency is not a feeling. It's a cognitive process. The brain constantly evaluates whether effort produces legible outcomes. If it does, action feels meaningful. If it doesn't, action becomes noise. You can work harder, plan better, optimize endlessly, but if the results are delayed, abstract, or impossible to trace back to you, the mind stops registering effort as something worth investing in. This is where many people get confused. They think motivation is the problem, or discipline, or willpower. But the issue isn't internal. It's structural. When feedback is unclear, the brain cannot learn. When causality is obscured, intention loses weight. And when outcomes feel disconnected from action, agency collapses quietly. This is why people can feel exhausted without feeling productive. Why they can be busy without feeling effective. Why they can make decisions constantly and still feel stuck. The loop never completes. Agency doesn't require success. It requires clarity. Even failure strengthens agency, as long as you understand what failed and why. But when success and failure are both opaque, when outcomes feel arbitrary or delayed beyond recognition, the brain adapts in a very specific way. It stops treating action as meaningful. Not because you're lazy. Not because you don't care. But because the system you're acting within no longer rewards agency with understanding. How modern life systematically breaks the agency loop. In theory, modern life should maximize agency. We have more choices, more tools, more opportunities than any generation before us. But in practice, it does the opposite. Modern systems separate action from outcome. Effort is no longer followed by a clear response. Results are delayed, diffused, or filtered through layers of abstraction. You study, but the payoff is measured years later, if at all. You work, but the impact of what you do is buried inside systems too large to perceive. You make good decisions, yet nothing visibly changes. From the brain's perspective, this is catastrophic for agency. The mind doesn't evaluate effort morally. It evaluates it causally. It constantly asks a simple question: did what I just did matter? And increasingly, the answer is unclear. When feedback is delayed, the loop weakens. When outcomes are abstract, the loop fractures. When causality becomes statistical instead of personal, the loop collapses. This creates a specific psychological effect. You are constantly acting, but rarely completing anything. Constantly adjusting, but never resolving. Constantly optimizing, but never arriving. Even failure loses its meaning. When something goes wrong, it's impossible to tell whether the cause was your decision, the timing, the system, or forces completely outside your control. And when failure can't be diagnosed, it can't be learned from. Over time, the brain adapts. It lowers the emotional weight of action. It stops expecting clarity. It stops investing fully in intention. Not because action stopped being necessary, but because action stopped being legible. This is why modern life often feels exhausting without feeling productive. Why people feel busy but strangely absent from their own actions. The loop isn't broken violently. It's eroded quietly. And when agency erodes, something else takes its place. Motion without ownership. Choice without consequence. Activity without meaning. Why goals don't fix the problem? When people notice this loss of agency, the usual response is predictable. Set clearer goals. Define objectives. Create plans. Track progress. The assumption is simple. If action feels empty, it must be because direction is missing. But goals don't restore agency. In many cases, they actively replace it. A goal only strengthens agency if the path toward it is genuinely yours. If you control the method, the risk, and the trade-offs involved. In most modern systems, this isn't how goals work. The objective is defined externally. The acceptable paths are pre-selected. The criteria for success are fixed in advance. You're not acting, you're aligning. This is why so many goal-driven systems feel hollow. Productivity frameworks. Performance metrics. Achievement ladders. They generate movement, but not ownership. You advance, but the advancement isn't an expression of intention. It's compliance with a structure that already knows where you're supposed to end up. From the brain's perspective, this is not agency. It's task execution. The loop doesn't close because intention never fully enters the system. You're optimizing within constraints you didn't choose, toward outcomes you didn't define. This is also why many highly structured games fail to deliver meaning. Objectives are highlighted. Paths are marked. Failure is softened, reversed, or reframed. You can't truly fail, and therefore, you can't truly succeed. Progress becomes inevitable. And when progress is inevitable, action loses weight. Goals don't create meaning by themselves. They only create meaning when they emerge from intention and carry real consequences for how the world unfolds. Without that, goals don't restore agency. They just create motion that feels increasingly disconnected from the person moving. What changes in worlds without goals? Worlds without goals operate on a completely different assumption. They don't try to guide you. They don't try to motivate you. They don't try to teach you what matters. They simply exist and respond. There is no objective waiting to validate your actions. No system that checks whether you're playing correctly. No predefined outcome that gives your effort legitimacy. And because of that, intention becomes unavoidable. If nothing is prescribed, you have to decide what matters. If nothing is guaranteed, you have to choose what risk is acceptable. If nothing is framed as success, you have to define it yourself. This is the moment where agency re-enters the system. Action is no longer a response to instruction. It becomes an expression of priority. When you act in these worlds, the system doesn't ask why. It doesn't care what you were trying to achieve. It only reacts to what you actually did. And that reaction is consistent. You build something, the world changes. You neglect something, the consequences accumulate. You make a mistake, it doesn't disappear. It reshapes the situation. This consistency is critical. The brain doesn't need encouragement. It needs legibility. When cause and effect remain stable, intention regains weight. You start thinking in terms of outcomes, not checklists. In terms of responsibility, not optimization. Paradoxically, the absence of goals creates more structure, not less. Because structure emerges from interaction, not prescription. Instead of chasing markers, you begin managing consequences. Instead of completing tasks, you begin shaping a trajectory. Nothing in the world promises that your effort will pay off. But when it does, you know exactly why. And when it doesn't, you know exactly what failed. That clarity is what restores the agency loop. Not freedom without limits, but action without approval. Kenshi, RimWorld, and Minecraft as systems, not games. Kenshi, RimWorld, and Minecraft are often mentioned together, but not because they share aesthetics, pacing, or mechanics. What connects them is not how they look, it's how they treat the player. None of these worlds are designed to protect you. None of them scale themselves around your intentions. None of them assume that your survival, success, or progress matters. In Kenshi, the world does not slow down for you. You start weak, exposed, and irrelevant. Strength is not granted through progression, it is earned through endurance. Failure is not a lesson prompt. It is a state you must live in until you adapt. The world doesn't ask what you were trying to do. It only responds to what you actually did. RimWorld works differently, but the principle is the same. There is no victory condition that validates your colony. Survival emerges from hundreds of small decisions: how you allocate labor, how you respond to scarcity, how you absorb loss. When something collapses, the system doesn't reset the situation. It incorporates the failure into the ongoing reality. The story is not written for you, it is assembled from consequences. Minecraft strips this even further. There is no narrative pressure at all. No required progression. No external reason to act. Meaning exists only where you decide to place it. A structure matters because you committed time and attention to it. A loss hurts because you allowed yourself to care. What these systems refuse to do is just as important as what they allow. They don't frame your actions. They don't justify your choices. They don't rescue you from the weight of consequence. They provide a stable set of rules and let outcomes emerge naturally from interaction. This is why even mundane actions in these worlds feel significant. Not because they are dramatic, but because nothing guarantees that effort will be rewarded, and nothing prevents failure from reshaping everything that follows. The system does not collaborate with your intention, but it consistently responds to your actions. And that consistency is what makes agency possible. Why this feels like meaning, not just freedom. What people describe as freedom in these worlds is often misunderstood. It's not the absence of rules. And it's not the ability to do anything at any time. It's the presence of consequence. Meaning doesn't emerge because options are unlimited. It emerges because choices are binding. When you act in these worlds, the outcome doesn't politely step aside afterward. It stays. It alters the environment you have to continue living in. This is where meaning begins to form. The brain experiences meaning when effort reshapes reality in a way that cannot be ignored. When actions leave traces that must be dealt with rather than dismissed. In worlds without goals, responsibility is unavoidable. If something breaks, it stays broken. If something works, it works because you carried it through, not because the system wanted you to succeed. There is no narrative layer softening the impact. No invisible hand reframing mistakes as part of the experience. No guarantee that failure will be redeemed later. And paradoxically, this lack of protection is what makes engagement sustainable. Small decisions feel heavy. Small victories feel earned. Small failures feel instructive rather than humiliating. Not because the system is kind, but because it is honest. Meaning does not require success. It requires coherence. When intention, action, and consequence align, the mind treats the experience as real. This is why people can spend hundreds of hours in these worlds without chasing an endpoint. They are not accumulating progress. They are inhabiting the results of their own decisions. And that is something modern life increasingly fails to offer. Why guided games break agency at first glance? Guided games seem more accessible. They explain themselves. They highlight objectives. They tell you what matters and where to go. But this guidance comes at a cost. The moment a system tells you what you should be doing, your intention becomes secondary. Your action is no longer the source of meaning, it's a response to instruction. Markers replace curiosity. Objectives replace judgment. Progress becomes inevitable as long as you comply. From the brain's perspective, the agency loop weakens. You still act. The world still changes. But the change no longer belongs to you. Failure loses its teeth. Mistakes are softened, rewound, or reframed. The system protects you from the full weight of consequence. And while this feels comfortable, it breaks something essential. If failure is temporary, success is cosmetic. If outcomes are guaranteed, effort loses weight. If the system already knows where you're supposed to end up, your choices become decorative. This is why heavily guided games often feel polished but hollow. They move smoothly. They reward constantly. They rarely frustrate. But they also rarely demand responsibility. You're not shaping the world, you're being escorted through it. Worlds without goals do the opposite. They don't care whether you succeed. They don't rescue you from mistakes. They don't validate your decisions. They simply respond. And that indifference is not cruelty. It's what allows action to remain meaningful. Because agency cannot exist where the outcome is already decided. Final conclusion: we don't gravitate toward worlds without goals because we want chaos. And not because we want unlimited freedom. We gravitate toward them because they restore something precise. They restore the feeling that action belongs to us. In these worlds, nothing is assigned meaning in advance. Nothing guarantees success. Nothing reframes failure to make it painless. And because of that, every decision carries weight. You're not progressing along a path. You're shaping a situation. Meaning doesn't come from reaching an endpoint. It comes from inhabiting the consequences of your own choices. That's why these worlds feel grounding rather than escapist. They don't distract you from reality. They remind you of a version of reality where effort and outcome were still connected. Not optimized. Not guided. Not protected. Just honest. Worlds without goals don't give you purpose. They give you responsibility. And responsibility, when consequences are clear, is what agency actually feels like. The uncomfortable question: if we understand all of this, if we recognize what agency feels like, if we know why it disappears, then one question remains. Why does this feeling feel safe in games, but dangerous in real life? Why do we reclaim agency so easily in simulations, but hesitate to act when the consequences are real? If worlds without goals show us how action is supposed to feel, why do we avoid closing that same loop outside of them? That question doesn't belong here. Because the answer isn't about games. It's about risk. error, and the price of acting in a world that rarely forgives mistakes.